Hello and good evening. I'm Catherine Jackson.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lyzzie Golliher. I'm from the MFA Creative Writing program at Old Dominion, and I am co-director of the 2020 ODU Literary Festival. And with Catherine, I have the pleasure of welcoming you to this year's Literary Festival, whose theme is Grit and Grace. When I think about how this is the 43rd year of LitFest and you throw in the pandemic for good measure, I'm a bit blown away. To bring together some of today's most distinguished and exciting writers takes a lot of work. In fact, I can safely say that behind the scenes planning for this festival started in November last year, a mere month after we closed the last festival. So I want to thank my colleague and tireless co-director, Catherine Jackson, who rose to every occasion and made everything on our tag team feel so easy. Thank you, Catherine. And now, Catherine and I would also like to acknowledge some of the most important individuals and groups who've made it possible for us to present these programs despite all the new challenges we're facing.
We'd like to thank the Norfolk Commission on the Arts and Humanities, the Edie and Forrest P. White Endowment, the College of Arts and Letters Dean Kent Sandstrom, Executive Director for the Arts Cullen Strawn, Assistant Vice President Karen Meyer, Christina Lapuma, Sun Win, and the staff of the ODU Office of Community Engagement, without whom we could not be doing this festival, Associate Vice President Renee Olander and ODU Virginia Beach, Kathleen Rhodes and the Gay Cultural Studies Program, Dr. Jennifer Fish and the Department of Women's Studies, Michael Candlewall and the Muse Writers Center, Mark Katz and the ODU Village Bookstore, and MFA Program Assistant Tracy Rice Weber. Thank you. Tonight we begin with creative writers from the 2020 graduating class. To introduce them, we'd like to call up John McManus, Director of the MFA Creative Writing Program. John, if you would turn on your microphone and camera now.
Okay, can you see me? Thank you, Louisa and Catherine. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the ODU Master of Fine Arts and Creative Writing Program's annual third-year student reading starring the MFA class of 2020. Every spring since the first ODU MFA class earned their degrees in 1997, our graduates have been giving public readings from their thesis manuscripts every spring, that is, until this extraordinary year, when the reading we'd planned for April 24th got sidelined along with every other public performance around the globe. At that time, the graduates chose to postpone in hopes of convening in person. We'll still do that when we can, but for now we've invited them to open our 43rd annual ODU Literary Festival. As you've heard, our theme is grit and grace, and no one I know has shown more grit or more grace than today's readers. When the pandemic shutdown hit, they were about 6 weeks from graduation. At the height of the lockdown, as global uncertainty seemed to be tripling by the day, they completed their remaining coursework and defended their theses online with aplomb. The thesis manuscripts they'll be reading from for up to 9 minutes apiece are as singular as this year in which they've become Masters of Fine Arts. We'll be hearing from fiction writers Hannah Trammell, Lizzie Golliher, Bhavika Sicka, Raoul Lobo, and Nina White, nonfiction writer James Beardsley, and poet David Jacobson. To Hannah and Lizzie and Bhavika and Raoul and Nina and James and David, let me say before we start, as great as this webinar format is for broadcasting your reading around the world, it doesn't allow for audience applause. I want to assure you right now, we'll all be cheering for you when you take the virtual stage, and again when you're done, and all along the way. And if we were all able to turn our mics on, this is what we'd hear. So, spending time among writers as talented as the 7 of you makes my job a joy. On behalf of everyone present, let me say thank you for being here and being part of the Literary Festival this year. We've chosen to go in alphabetical order, which means our first reader is James Beardsley. So James, would you please turn on your microphone and your video?
Thank you, John. So I'll be reading some excerpts from my essay, Diagnosis Weirdo, from my thesis of the same title. Acne, pubic hair, a therapist. Three things that I first got in the 6th grade, carry complicated social stigmas, and are, to one degree or another, still with me. In 2002, when I was 12, I, my acne, and my pubic hair ambled into a therapist's office to seek treatment for whatever the hell was going on in my life. The psychologist's name was Dr. Zoll, and he aided me in many ways during those years. But the biggest change he helped guide me through came after he diagnosed me with a disorder I'd never heard of, Asperger's syndrome. 7th grade. That was when, several months into therapy, I received the diagnosis. I was reluctant to take it seriously, so I didn't. 4 years would pass before I fully accepted the label and its implications. By then, I was beginning to understand how it affected me and the people I interacted with. My shrink tried to warn me, but I was slow in realizing that, yes, I had Asperger's, and that it would inform my entire life. Dear James, 2002. Hey, bud, how's life? Just kidding, I still remember. It kind of sucks for you at the moment, but don't worry, it's going to get better, but not before it gets a whole lot worse. Actually, maybe worry a little after all. So here's the deal. Dr. Zoll is not a quack. You have Asperger's. And I'm telling you, it may sound like a grilled cow, but you're going to want to take it seriously. You're social and desirable. There's no avoiding that. But the thing about this label is that you now have a handy explanation to offer people when you screw up. Correct your teacher in front of the entire class? I'm sorry, I have Asperger's. Call a girl you barely know a bitch? You were joking, doesn't matter. Sorry, Asperger's. Make a faux sexual comment about your friend who misses the comedic subtext? See, there's this disorder called Asperger's. Burn down your school to avoid facing the peers who make fun of you every day? Even Asperger's can't remotely justify this. I sincerely apologize. So you can't overcome this except with the slow progression of time, but you can try to explain to people why you said the awful thing you said, or why you seem to callously ignore their obvious emotional cues, or why you generally seem like the biggest creep on the planet. It's the Asperger's. Some people will understand, some people won't. But either way, at least you try to enlighten them about your condition. Just apologize and move on. If they can't accept you for who you are, fuck them. And if that sounds too forward, I apologize. I have Asperger's. Love, James 2020. Here are some of the signs you or someone you know might have Asperger's. Challenges with nonverbal communication. Once, my 6th grade English teacher, trying to be funny, started dancing in the middle of the classroom. Amused, I called out, "You look stupid, Miss Stam." She stopped dancing and said, "Not so much, James." Joke rejoinder. Successful repartee, I thought. Later that day, as I passed her room again, I made a second joke at her expense, pretending to confuse her with my male social studies teacher. She stopped me and asked if I understood how hurtful such comments could be. I was stunned. Her signals that I'd offended her had flown far enough over my head to knock a low-flying airplane out of the sky. I offered a half-hearted apology and walked away, crushed. Conversely, when I was in the 3rd grade, my mother once asked me how my teacher was supposed to know how I was feeling if I didn't tell her. I replied with total sincerity by looking into my eyes. So verbal communication occasionally kicked my ass too. Obsession with specific, often unusual topics. Growing up, I had 2 religions, Southern Baptism and a rotating roster of narrow, intense interests. These interests included the Power Rangers, the Disney canon, Star Wars, newspaper comics, The Lord of the Rings, classic cinema, Japanese role-playing games, and the Powerpuff Girls. 2 notes. 1, this list is incomplete and non-chronological, and 2, I apologize for nothing. Lack of eye contact or reciprocal conversation. In middle school, I engaged in an exercise with a mental health professional where I had to hold his gaze for as long as possible while conversing with him. He assured me that if I made it 2 whole minutes, I would graduate from Asperger's school and become a normal person. I never made it that long, and my Asperger's persists to this day. As for reciprocal conversation, my rendition of the "How are you? Fine, and you? Can't complain" tango usually went more like, "How are you? Fine." No doubt people thought I was an ass. Tendency to discuss self rather than others. Oh yes, for years I would bore people comatose with long-winded anecdotes about the extramarital affairs of American presidents or impromptu renditions of my favorite Garfield comics. In my mind, there was no distinction between my interests and other people's. Poor hand-eye coordination. Every year in elementary school, I played sports. I was not good, and the other kids resented me for it. Once, while playing baseball, during a rare moment of triumph, I caught the third out of the inning, and one of my own teammates said, "Look, he's so proud of himself." Whatever pride I might have been feeling promptly dissolved into shame. Excessively lofty diction. So you want to talk like an Aspie. There are two guidelines to keep in mind. Never use an obvious word when you could use an obscure one instead, and always up the verbosity so you sound as smart as possible. Here's a table to get you started. On the left, we have normal, and on the right, Aspergerese. Do you need help? Are you in need of assistance? Happy birthday. I hope you're enjoying the anniversary of your date of birth. Did you get a fake ID? Your documentation appears to be of dubious authenticity. You talk funny. You have an excess of linguistic peculiarities. You seem like kind of a weirdo. Do you have Asperger's too? I can tell you're getting bored. I'm out. Talks about self for another 10 minutes. Limited or inappropriate social interactions. Hoo boy. I made all sorts of weird or asshole remarks in my childhood and adolescence, usually when I was trying to be funny. More than any other symptom of Asperger's, this one impaired my ability to make friends. I never understood why people got so offended when I made sexual jokes in the middle of class, or God jokes in the middle of church, or race jokes anytime ever. They were just being prudish, sensitive, politically correct. When people occasionally called out my behavior, I refused to admit or even realize I'd done anything wrong. More often, they endured my remarks in offended silence and added me to their mental list of people never to willingly associate with. That was fine with me. I didn't need them anyway, at least until I suddenly did. When Dr. Zoll told me, all those years ago, that I had Asperger's syndrome, how could I have known he was diagnosing my life? How, except through experience and time, countless mistakes, and the suffering of years, could I have become anything but the person I already was? In high school, my guidance counselor once suggested that I join a support group for people with Asperger's. I declined, saying I didn't want the disorder to define me. But it did define me. Every relationship I've had, every friendship I've fought for, has been affected by the diagnosis I received in the 7th grade. It clarifies so much about the trajectory of my life that I almost pity those who lack a diagnosis with which to explain their faults. I can't separate Asperger's from my personality. Remove it, and I'm not the same person. Nothing about who I am makes sense, divorced from the context of my disorder. I have Asperger's. I manage. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, James. And our next reader will be Lizzie Gallaher. So Lizzie, will you please unmute yourself and start your video?
Thank you, John. I will be reading from an excerpt from my thesis / novel in progress, Colin and the Nockmaar. Dokiri woke up to the sound of screaming and an unpleasant pain in his tentacles. He, Tessa, and Tash were pinned to the ceiling of the transport, limbs caught underneath them, barely able to move. There was no question. They were falling out of the sky, and fast. "What happened?" he shouted to Tessa. "I'm not sure," she said. "We've been hit with some kind of electromagnetic pulse. All the controls are dead." "How long do we have?" said Dokiri. Tessa's face was a shade of greenish gray. "I don't know," she said. He could barely make her out over Tash's screaming. "No more than a minute." Less than a minute, until their transport crashed into the ocean, killing them on impact. Dokiri felt like throwing up, but there really wasn't time. Suddenly, the screaming stopped. Dokiri glanced over at Tash, who appeared to have fallen unconscious. His tentacles were crushed against the ceiling beneath him. They had been looking really bad earlier, purple and swollen from his fall at the fence. He had probably passed out from the pain of it. "We need to get down to the elixir," Tessa said. "The wings wouldn't risk losing their precious cargo." She was right. The wings wouldn't want to damage their elixir by shooting down the transport, so the controls down in the hatch were probably set so that in case of an emergency, the transport might crash, but the elixir would remain intact. Getting down there was probably their only hope. "Can you reach the hatch?" he asked. Tessa nodded. Tensing up, she launched herself off the ceiling down toward the hatch, barely managing to grab it with the very tip of her tentacles. "Tash, wake up," Dokiri yelled. "We gotta go." Tash didn't move. Tessa wrenched over the hatch and lowered herself down below. "The gravity does feel different," she called up. We might make it, but you have to get down here now. Not yet. Dokiri twisted his body a little closer to Tash. I've almost reached him. There isn't time. Tessa dragged on Dokiri's tentacles, lifting him off the ceiling and away from his brother. Dokiri lunged with all his strength to get back to Tash, but Tessa was stronger than he was. It took her only a few seconds to yank him inside and slam the hatch door shut. Dokiri threw his weight against it, but she had sealed it with her special locking device. Let me out, Dokiri yelled. I can still reach him. If I push off from down here, I can get to him. I'm so sorry, she said, starting to cry. We can't. We'll hit any second. A deafening slap echoed in the chamber. The transport collapsed as it hit the water, like crunching a can under a rock. All Dokiri felt was a light weight on his shoulders, like someone from above giving him a slight push. He stumbled, but Tessa was still holding on to him. The elixir, tightly packed in crates, barely moved at all. Then everything was still. The sound of it filled his ears, that hollow emptiness. All he could hear was Tessa breathing next to him, her breaths much slower and steadier than his own. He listened to that breathing, completely devoid of all thoughts and feelings. If he emptied himself, he wouldn't have to think or move or act. He could... Dokiri, Tessa whispered. Her voice was impossibly far away. We need to get out of here. The wings, they'll be here any second. He would give anything to drown out that voice. He closed his eyes. If he didn't react to this reality, it might disappear. He might open his eyes again and be safe at home, surrounded by his family, whole and unbroken and brimming with life. He might play with Tash willingly for a change, and be reacquainted with that strange, simple peace that came only when he and Tash were together. Like the world was, surprisingly, actually not that bad. That there was kindness and beauty if you just had a 9-year-old to show it to you. Shit, Dokiri, you have to get up, Tessa yelled. I am not leaving you here. When he still didn't move, she leaned in close to him. Tash might be alive, she whispered. We might still be able to save him. Electricity fired through Dokiri's body, shaking him out of his fantasy. Alive. She was right. He was being selfish, trying to escape pain he might not even need to feel. If Tash was still alive, maybe he could still help him. Maybe he could get his family back. Dokiri nodded. Yeah, he said hoarsely. Okay. Tessa unlocked the hatch and he levered himself out. The transport was in terrible shape. There was barely enough room to stand up. The ceiling had caved in and the benches were smashed to bits. Tash was lying crumpled in the corner, looking smaller than Dokiri had ever seen him. Oh no, Tessa said softly. He could still be alive. The mantra played in Dokiri's mind over and over. It was a lot easier to believe when he didn't have to look over in that corner. He crawled over to Tash's body, using all of his concentration to avoid slipping on the blood-soaked floor. One step at a time, don't think about what it means. Tessa was right behind him, steadying him. He was grateful for that. When they reached him, she gingerly put her ear over the remains of his mouth. Her eyes widened. He's breathing, she said. He's alive. Dokiri didn't know how that was possible. Tash looked broken. His eyes were closed, and it looked like his body had been smashed with a hammer. Anyone would believe he was dead. If he ever woke up, he would probably wish he was. What do we do? He said in a hollow voice. I don't know what to do. We have to leave, Tessa said gently. Tash will be fine right here, but we need to go. You want to leave him? The words were foreign to him. He could feel his mind drifting away, up out of the ruined ceiling and into the wide expanse of sky. There was peace up there somewhere, a small pocket of the world where this wasn't happening. He just had to find it. He'll be safe, Tessa said. She inched a little closer to Dokiri and the door. They won't kill someone who can't even move. They'll leave him right here, safe and sound. And when they take away the elixir, the transport will sink, and he'll be able to go down into the ocean. He'll like that. It'll feel so good on his skin. She rested a tentacle on his back and began maneuvering him toward the bent and broken door. No, Dokiri said distantly. No. Maybe there are some of our kind at the bottom, Tessa murmured, moving away the pieces of door blocking their path. Maybe they'll find him and care for him the way you would. Maybe one day you'll see him again. There was a quiet splash as they dropped into the water. Dokiri could hear yelling in the distance, the flutter of many wings beating through the air. His dry and puckered skin drank the ocean water in greedily. It would have felt incredible to someone capable of feeling that way. Let's go, Tessa whispered. Dokiri was floating, still hanging on to the door frame of the transport. He couldn't let go. His remote pocket of sky had shattered. A spike of unfiltered pain tore through his skull. If he let go, Tash would be gone. He would really just be completely fucking gone. And it would be all his fault. He was the one who had chosen to leave the safety of their island to try to become a Nakmar of all things. He couldn't believe how unbelievably stupid he had been. What he wanted was to stay on the transport with Tash, wait for the wings to show up, and then kill as many of them as he could. He would die, but at least Tash wouldn't be all alone in there. To leave him and just save himself, it was unbearable to think about. But it wasn't just him. Tessa was there, hanging on his tentacle, looking at him anxiously. He had to stay alive for her, if nothing else. He couldn't leave her alone, too. He swallowed the lump in his throat and released his grip on the transport. Together, he and Tessa drifted down to be swallowed by the sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Lizzie. And our next reader is David Jacobson. So David, will you please bring yourself onto the virtual stage?
How you guys doing? I'm going to read a couple poems. I wrote a lot of these this last spring, and I think they're my favorite poems that I've written. The first one is called At 16. At 16. When your mom barges into the men's changing room at Kohl's as you're trying on jeans, you say, "Mom," in a tone that's the vocal equivalent of the warning shot Clint Eastwood might fire over the head of a trespasser. It's automatic. The release of the pressure valve built into your brain, triggered by anything she does that makes you remotely uncomfortable, which is almost everything. "Mom," you say, when she sings along to the Beatles, or tears up at the end of The Hobbit, or bakes cookies for the first girl you invite over. When the football game cuts to a Viagra ad, and Mom tells you and your brother that Dad doesn't need any help in that department. Mom, how else would you have survived adolescence without this safe word you could beam up like a force field, this soundbite you could drag and drop into any situation, like a producer mixing a track heavy with bass distortion. Mom, 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 tuned up loud enough to drown out whatever she's saying, because you want to avoid embarrassment at all costs, even if the cost is the slow and complete rejection of everything she wants to share. You can probably hear the ice cream truck in the background there. The next poem I'm going to read is also a close reading of a word, the word cougar. This poem is called Two Cougars. Two cougars. First, the feline, as sleek as its name, leaping off the page of my neighbor's coffee table book, muscles rippling like piano wire under fur the color of a sandstorm. In school, it was fractions and civil war. Outside the classroom window, a pink nose crinkled, the flick of a tail beckoned. I followed from boulder to boulder, over pine needles and leaves, stopping to lap water at a stream or rub up against a tree, roaming a forest as deep as my imagination, until the day in the locker room when Ben Chester called someone's mom a cougar. And just like that, a new creature slunk into my thoughts, dressed in low-slung jeans and tapping ash from a cigarette. The cougar of reality TV and the wet dreams of adolescent landscapers who fantasize about a glass of iced tea on the porch, leading to a refill in the cool shade of the kitchen. I still don't get how a word can mean two things at once, sometimes even more. It's as though both cougars live at the same address, sharing the Wi-Fi and doing Pilates. They take their steak rare and alternate washing the dishes. Say you go over to visit with one, and the other never leaves the room, like a chaperone or a conjoined twin. They sit there, perched on the sofa, the woman and the big cat, purring, swaddled in furs, sizing you up hungrily with mascaraed eyes. This next poem was inspired by Dr. Moberly and a writing prompt he came up with. It's called Notes from the Land Without Nail Clippers. In the parallel world where nail clippers were never invented, people's toes grow into great calcified husks that can't be contained by socks or shoes, and their mutant fingernails are like scythes that thresh the air beside them as they walk. With such sharp and unretractable claws at their fingertips, their culture has no use for balloons, bowling balls, silks, or toilet paper. They dress in all leather and greet one another by nuzzling foreheads. When camping, they impale marshmallows on their 5-pronged pitchforks and slow roast them in the embers. They rake leaves with bare hands. Nail painters approach their task like Michelangelo, dreaming beyond solid shapes and sparkles to create frescoes of biblical scenes and portraits of swordfish and skyscrapers. In bed with so many blades, they've learned to hold their partners with a degree of tenderness that exceeds our own. Some wear sheaths they swap out every few months to fit their ever-lengthening nails, the way a hermit crab continually trades up for a larger shell. The length and sturdiness of one's nails connotes social status and desirability, which is no more absurd to them than the 5-day work week or taxes, or the concept of a chair as a thing to sit on. When two people meet for the first time, they notice the size of the other person's nails, hardly noticing that they noticed them, and they then make almost unconscious comparisons to their own nail length to determine how to treat this fellow citizen. Is it surprising that many secretly take keratin supplements to harden their nails while publicly proclaiming themselves all natural? A few protesters sever their nails with pruning shears or scissors, and on national TV, the leaders brand these dissenters mutilators and crazies and pass laws to make them unhireable. In coffee shops and courthouses, the largest nailed people flaunt their grime-crusted witch fingers like Rolexes and wield them like weapons, which of course they are. But everyone undresses with the care of a bomb diffuser snipping wires, and everybody's body is crosshatched with scars. The last poem I'm going to read is about crossing into Canada a year and a half ago and being stopped by Border Patrol. Border crossing en route to Quebec, July 2019. A month after I signed my brother's car into my name, Canadian Border Police search it and find 4 syringes and vials filled with fluid tucked in the pocket behind the driver's seat. And when I say I've never seen those before, which is true, the agents look at me like, sure, buddy, of course. And they then escort Kate and me into the station, where a sign informs us that everything we do and say is now being recorded. The agents pat us down. They raise the sleeves of my Hawaiian shirt and inspect my biceps, which are veiny and unscarred. The female agent seems apologetic, but the man wears the twisted smirk of someone who savors domination. They empty my wallet and expose the condom I carried during my year of unwanted celibacy, and I feel sheepish. Kate's on the pill, and we've been exclusive for a long time. So why do I still have this sad Trojan lurking in my coin purse? The agents remind me that I'm responsible for everything in my car. They ask again what the needles are for. and I can't help but think of my brother, his moodiness, and the 30 pounds of muscle he packed onto his frame. I thought I knew him, and now I'm not so sure. The woman takes the needles to another room, and the man returns to my car, leaving Kate and I alone, except for the surveillance camera with its cyclops eye. The man lifts our backpacks out of the trunk and sifts through Kate's panties. He turns our books upside down, fanning out the pages and flapping the covers so they look like birds struggling to fly. He opens my journal, where I have inscribed the details of my secret life, both real and imagined, and he reads from multiple sections for longer than Canadian national security likely necessitates, given that those pages don't include a manual for manufacturing meth, or even a plot to smuggle mukluks out of Manitoba. Later, my brother will tell me the needles were only blood thinners from his operation. Later, I'll find this funny. But when the man returns from searching my car and says we're free to go, I'm shaking, though I know that on the spectrum of encounters with law enforcement, this is nothing. Welcome to Canada, he says, staring at Kate and me and smiling this shit-eating smile, as though he sees something in us we can't yet see, as though he has us all figured out. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And the next reader whom I'll ask to start his audio and video is Raoul Lobo. Welcome, Raoul.
All right. Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks for that welcome. And thanks, everyone, for being here. Okay. All right. I'm just going to read some poems. All right. The first poem is called Oedipal. Yes, it is true, dear friends. I cry. My dark fat lips turn upside down like succulent prawns waiting to be fried. My shoulders slouch and become imploring instead of strong. My hands move upwards, asking Mummy to pick me up, but I stop them just in time. I become ugly, but I don't know this, which makes me even uglier. If your friends only knew, she'd say to me, they wouldn't want to be your friends anymore. But I didn't stop because I didn't care about my friends. I only cared about her. Would she be mine still? Would I be hers? I knew I would, but it wasn't enough. I wanted her all to myself. Not with a sigh of frustration, not with an ounce of disappointment, not with her eyes rolling, not with a you should, not with a you are so. I wanted her whole. I still do. I am Genghis Khan and she the oceanic plains, the vast steeps that are my birthright, that I will soak in blood just so I can call them my own, without reservation, without conditions, without a fucking asterisk. I like to say she ruined me, which is like saying God ruined man. Both are true, they just don't really mean anything. What chance did I stand? Born not into the world, but her world. I gasp like a fish, struggling to pull oxygen from the air. My bright, perfect, healthy gills, utterly and totally useless. I want to kill her sometimes, just to know what the world is like without her. Because when you put a sword through the heart of God, the world gets remade anew. Every atom made in God's own image gets reconfigured instantaneously. What shape will it take then? Thank you. The next one's called Being Touched by a stranger who despises my existence. I needed a haircut before my big meeting. I wanted my hair trimmed on the sides and longer on the front. It was the only place I could afford. It was close. I didn't have a car. The front? She asked with utter contempt and annoyance, mocking an accent I didn't think I had. I pointed to the front of my hair. She grabbed it and pulled my head forward, her breath hot on my face. Then she chopped it off and asked, "Good?" I could have left after that, but who would fix my hair then? She yanked my head back and forth, breathing her revulsion into my skin. Her scissors nipped the back of my neck. When I put my hand to get her to stop, her nostrils flared. I put them back down. I could have left, but that would have made her angrier. I left when she told me it was over. An oily film covered every inch of my skin and made me feel dirty. My big meeting didn't feel big anymore. At home, I wanted to complain, but words made it all seem so trivial. I took a hot shower to sear the film of my skin. It didn't work. I didn't want to be touched that day. I did not have the words to explain why. All right, this next poem is called Evelyn. Uh, it's about my great grandmother and kind of the uh, complicated legacy she has. I am the son of the daughter of the son of Evelyn Mascarenhas, a lifelong supporter of the British Raj. She had two other names, one from her plantation-owning family in seaside Mangalore, where every morning her father called an assembly of his workers and walked around to make sure they stood perfectly straight, and another from her first husband, who managed to kill himself with liquor before he killed her with blows. She topped the Bombay presidency in the nursing exams, a fact my family still celebrates. Her sons from her first husband despised her for getting married again and didn't even come to her funeral. Her second husband, my great-grandfather, was a gambler and threw away her money almost as fast as she made it. When the independence movement has surged and men knocked the door and asked for British goods to throw into a grand bonfire, she told them they didn't have any. As my grandfather, still a boy, clutched on to his prized trilby behind his back, which would be his secret shame for years to come. Years later, as a teenager back from boarding school for the summer, my grandfather invited his best friend over for lunch. Evelyn was polite, but uncharacteristically quiet, and even somewhat curt. As soon as the friend left, she said, "He's not from a good caste. Why do you need to talk to him?" As my grandfather tells it, he screamed and told her off, the mother he adored, admired, and worshipped. Something he dared not do in later years, something his future wife would have paid good money to see. Evelyn was the facilitator of her son's marriage. Patriarchy or no, there was no question who was the head of the family. Bringing her boy what he wanted, an indulgence, a gift, even if she didn't see value in it. He was stubborn, her boy, and she loved him for it. But once the wedding was over, she almost seemed surprised that the girl came to live with them, that it wasn't just one big party that was done with. She cursed the life of her daughter-in-law, cursed her dark skin, her incompetence, her shameless behavior with her son, cursed her very existence. Now that she could not work, hate gave her purpose. Until the kids came. In a reaction exactly opposite to the marriage, she heard the news with displeasure, but when it became a reality, she experienced only love. Her new purpose, her new goal. Tiny people imbibing her discipline, her sense of duty, her intelligence. becoming loyal to her over their own parents, who were preoccupied with careers, sex, and the many anxieties of the young. Every time anything bad happened in the country, she longed for the days of the British. But when India, perpetual underdogs, got the chance to enter the Cricket World Cup final in 1983, she prayed the rosary again and again for every 8-hour match while listening to the radio, imploring Jesus to bless Kapil Dev and let him lift the trophy. Her prayers were answered. She begged the kids to write their names as Prabhu Mascarenhas, so that everyone would know that they came from good Brahmin stock, modern enough to be embarrassed by caste, and privileged enough to imagine that they transcended it. The kids were never Prabhus on paper, even though she waited for them to sleep so she could open their school bags and write it on their notebooks. Her husband died, and she felt only relief. Husbands. What was even the point? She lived for many years, enough to see the tiny people have their own tiny people. One of those tiny people being me. When she died, we were in another land across the sea. Who goes back just for a grandmother? My father said. My mother waited for him to go watch TV before allowing herself to cry, her whole body shivering uncontrollably. My uncle says when she died, she had cobwebs in her eyes. He still has nightmares about it. Evelyn and I are in sepia pictures, with her feeding me something and that something dripping down my face. I am told she loved me so very much. She is the coconut in my shrimp curry, the smattering of Konkani words I didn't know wasn't English. The reason we all think English is our mother tongue. She is my childhood book collection. She is my inherited apoliticism. The reason I was always taught to offer the help water in a special glass. She is my history. That's it. And the last poem, I call it Home. Home. It is the warmth of a welcoming armpit. It is anticipating 3-day-old Sorpatel. It is salivating together at the word Sorpatel. It is having the same answers in a word association game. Fight, pillow, dead, Nana, friend, Malcolm, mother, love, love, mother, father, fear. It is the freedom to fart, the luxury of being a slob, that nickname no one can ever know about. It is talking with our eyes, cracking each other's backs, old musty albums of us in sepia before it became a filter. It is what I wrap myself in when the day is done, the language of my dreams. It is where I think I am every time I wake up too suddenly. It is the adult whose cheeks I pinch and to whom I say, I knew you when you were so small. It is the blotch of paint that looks like a horse. It is rolling children into mattress burritos. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Raoul. Our next reader is Bhavika Sicka. Bhavika, will you please turn on your video?
So I'm going to be reading a chapter from my thesis, which is a novel in progress called Narmada. And this chapter is set in a village in an island somewhere in the Indian Ocean. Ever since that evening 4 years ago, and even before that, for as far back as he could remember, Asif had found it hard to fall asleep. He would see apparitions of men with horns and fearsome jaws, cackling and swinging from the roof of his hut with bony, elongated arms. As soon as he lowered the flame of the lamp beside his bed, he saw them again. They clung to the side of his almirah, and when the flame flickered, they began dancing like dervishes on the earthen walls, some even hovering over his cot. Even though Ismail was dead, his uncle's presence had never left his room. "If you tell anyone about us, about this love that we share," Ismail used to say to him, slurring and tripping over the words while downing his last peg of whiskey, sometimes tipping the ash of his cigarette into a glass, and at other times tying the drawstring of his undone pajamas, half silhouetted by the dim light of a kerosene lamp. "The Abhada will enter into your dreams. It will claw at your thoughts with its long pointed fingers and will drag you into the outer dark. And you, boy, will be plagued with nightmares till the end of your days," his uncle would say. He would stroke or ruffle Asif's hair, his breath heavy and laced with alcohol, sickly sweet. Asif turned the lamp off, hoping the darkness would rid the shadows. Then he covered his face with his sheet and pressed his eyes shut, his breath muffled. The rain was drumming against the earthen roof of the hut. It had been raining every night for the past week, and there seemed to be no respite in sight from the constant pattering and pouring. He had tried, ever since his uncle's death, to bury the thought of the storm, of the monsters that would visit his bedroom every night. But when he thought about the temple in the hills, the buried visions were stirred like sediments and began clouding his mind. He kicked off his sheet and turned on his side, pulling his knees up and folding his legs up into his stomach. Outside, the ocean crashed against the shore. His thoughts began to drift, and the din of the ocean faded. Soon he was floating through a fathomless sleep. But the nightmares came to him as they always did. In this one, he heard a man call out from the bottom of a dream. He found himself being pulled into a maelstrom and drowning into a vast, dark silence. Something was slithering into his mouth, like the wet and slimy tail of a lizard, and he was gagging, choking, unable to breathe. He saw his grandfather in the distance and tried to call out for help, but the words stuck in his throat like stones. "May the tide carry you through this. You will make it to the other side," said his grandfather, before disappearing into a corpse. Asif was jolted out of sleep by a distant shriek and shot up in bed, upright. He was covered in sweat and was hot with a fever. All he could hear were the waves, and he was sure that he was still dreaming. But then he heard it again, sure as the night, his aunt's hysterical screams from outside. He threw himself out of bed and across the cool mud floor, slipping into his rubber chappals and rushing out into the wet yard. The buffaloes in the shed were agitated and restless, snorting and grunting and stomping the ground as though even they had sensed that something was amiss and had seen death. He ran through the long grass towards the lighthouse. His Aunt Hussaina's silhouette became visible through the wind-slanted rain. Her sari was drenched and her hair was dripping. Her hair was a dripping stream flowing down the valley of her back. Her face was a cavern full of terror. "Come in, come with me, please, Thai, you will fall sick," he urged, pulling her, thinking that she had finally come unhinged. Warnings had been issued across the village not to venture too close to the sea. She resisted and stood motionless, mumbling incoherently, pointing towards the ocean. Its level had risen considerably, driven by the rain. He followed the direction of her finger. At first he saw nothing but the thick mass of mangroves, which, half submerged, looked like monsters crawling their way ashore on bony hands through a green shroud. Beyond these spidery and twisted masses of roots and leaves, the ocean stretched into blackness, into nowhere. A bloated mound lay within the massed vegetation at the water's edge. It had been thrown up by the ocean. He walked closer, ankle deep in water, his feet sinking into the wet sand. A stench reached him, foul and overpowering. He held up the hem of his sleeveless shirt against his nose and mouth, trying to quell the nausea and the rising dread. It was the mutilated lower half of a human torso, sodden and putrefying, severed just above the chest. The skin was loose and yellowish white, bleached of all color. The tissue was sloughing off, and it reminded him of an animal shedding its skin. Whelks stuck to the exposed cavity of the body's insides, and tiny worms squirmed their way out of the fraying fringes of flesh. This corpse hadn't been mutilated by fish. Something much larger had been responsible. Asif felt his stomach drop. The left side of the torso was marked by a long gash. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhavika. Our next reader is Hannah Trammell. Hannah, please unmute yourself and turn on your camera.
Thank you. So I was having a hard time deciding what to read with the time limit, but I think I will read some of the poems from my thesis. I have my little timer here to help me out. Okay, so the first poem that I would like to read is one that I wrote a little while before putting the manuscript together, but that I have changed up a little bit since then, called Gallery for Thinking Terrorism. Gallery for Thinking Terrorism. A Readings for Writers Redux. Terrorism is always that of the real. Baudrillard. Suggestions for writing. 1. Write about an incident of shame experienced. 2. Write an essay about the psychological effects of school on children. Gallery for Thinking Terrorism. Suicide bombing to the Western world is an unspeakable act. A to-the-point assignment rounds out the issue heaped on our country. Study the following images dealing with terrorism, then choose the image that most appeals to you. Answer and do. You put down the textbook, realize where it's going. Haven't you read this affect of sadness in other people you've known? Sadness a step toward justifying another terror. Victimhood a shield for a hunger for blood and skin and religion and reason. Our gallery concentrates on the United States evaporated. After an attack, rescuers sift through the physical, through talking heads inside televisions, and through the shreds of whys and whats. The irreconcilable divide between us becomes sharply clear. Us exploded. You wonder, why is it so few seem to argue with textbooks like these? Maybe it's like Hannibal Lecter said, and God loves a good mass slaughter. Why does everyone get uncomfortable when you remind them of the sacking of Constantinople, or the West Memphis Three, or all the new slaveries? A prisoner without his imam. Since when does whiteness and its God mean something not fundamental to the idea of terror? If hatred and fear are each other's inverse, then whiteness is the boogeyman who we all hate and fear, despite it never coming out from under the bed. The invisible violence of insecurity. All right. That is following along some themes that regarding media perception that really interest me. I also have a slightly newer poem to read called Curses that made it into the thesis, but it hasn't gone under nearly as much revision. Curses. I can only eat French galantine. If you were to ask me to explain my reasons and make it apparent, what it means to be only able to eat French galantine. I'd tell you it's a curse signifying what a curse is. And then I would tell you when I swallow cold duck and hard-boiled egg. It's the only thing that makes the aching pink of my throat feel useful. All other food tastes like lard soap and will not go down, just like the lard soap our mothers once shoved elbow deep into our bellies. Don't blame them. They thought they were bezoars. They thought they would keep us safe. But now the only thing I can bear is French galantine. It's the only thing that stays down. Thank you. The next poem that I would like to read, I can scroll up here. It's called A Haunted House Story. And this one it touches on a subject that's pretty close to my heart, but yes. A Haunted House Story. The starling's crushed skull on the pavement, like someone thought making a Pollock painting was as easy as violence. The red dewdrops and pink putty, poorly thought out shapes trying at the imaginary. A swarm of starlings in the sky, like an omen of the apocalypse, or the wrath of gods against ancient civilizations. Have we not earned back their wrath? At least when they were angry, we knew they were there. Starlings are hateful the same way the mentally ill are hateful. We don't think of them until they're clogging the engine or making a scene, but then we can think of little else. The sick should at least speak prophecy for how much their care costs. Don't they realize they owe us that? The next poem, these are rather short pieces, is an Ars Poetica. Ars Poetica. Writing words like they are the chemical construct of a cure to an unknown illness. Writing because there is nothing but the writing that can repair unspoken things. Writing because he's not in the room and his absence brings everything sharply into focus. Writing because it is obvious, the way it is obvious to the starling that falling is not crashing. And I'd like to end there. And thank you for this time and for letting us read and actually have a chance to do this.
Thank you, Hannah. And our final reader of the evening will be Nina White. So Nina, please reveal yourself.
Hi, everyone. So I just wanted to quickly give a shout out to James, Lizzie, Bhavika, Raoul, and David and Hannah. I love you guys. I also wanted to say a quick thank you to John for all the time and care that he put into my thesis. And special shout out to my husband, Sheldon, and my daughter, Josie, who are watching from the other room because Josie's too loud to be in here with me. So the story I'm going to read isn't actually a part of my thesis, but I wanted to be able to read it to completion for you all, or read something to completion. So this is something shorter that I wrote and rewrote a couple times, and it's inspired by and dedicated to my dad. It's called He Breaks Two. One morning when I was 17, I woke up soaked in blood. I was 3 days post my second knee surgery, and I pulled the covers down to see the deep red spreading from my bandages down into my sheets and up into my shorts and t-shirt. I screamed for my mom, certain that I was bleeding to death, the thick smell of my own blood surrounding me, making my head swim. My mom doubled over at the sight of me, clutching the frame of my door with shaking hands, calling for my dad. My dad came in after hearing my mom's cries, dressed for work in a crisp white shirt and tie. By the time he pulled me into his arms, my head was heavy. I could still smell the detergent on his shirt as I laid my head against it. It was still warm and stiff from the iron, now soaking up the blood that was pouring out of me. I saw the patterns of my blood against his spotless white shirt when I blinked. As he laid me in the back seat of his car, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen since I was a little girl, a reflection of someone he once was. My dad, on a bridge in the snow and rain, unable to move. When the nurses began unwrapping my bandages, I lost count of the layers of red they were pulling away from my bulging knee. My dad held me as they pierced me with needles, and I closed my eyes and bit my lip to keep my mind off the pressure of their knives against my tingling skin. He watched as they cut me open again, counted in my ear as they drained the fluid from my pulsing leg. Just breathe. Slow, steady. 1, 2, 3, 4. In and out, in and out. As he watched them, I watched him. I counted the creases around his eyes as he squinted at what the doctors were doing, noted the wrinkles he was always joking my sister and I gave him as soon as we hit our teens, named all the different shades of brown I could find in his eyes. And I saw it there again, the reflection. My dad, rain-soaked, ready and willing to jump. I was finally calm, high on painkillers and coming down from the adrenaline of being cut open, when my dad carried me back to his car. There was blood on his back seat, once spotless and freshly cleaned like his shirt, now splotched with the stains I'd left behind. I don't care about that, he said. I closed my eyes, now feeling the heat and pressure of the tears I'd cried. I opened them again to see his eyes watching me, perfectly framed from his rearview mirror. You're strong, he said. He used to always say this on the days where I felt weakest. I wondered if anyone had ever done that for him, on the days where he felt weak. I had always assumed that strong people knew they were strong, but now I wasn't so sure. When my dad was in graduate school, he almost jumped off a bridge. He'd gotten a full ride scholarship to Cornell University following undergrad, and he moved to New York with my mom immediately following their wedding, straight to 0-degree, middle of nowhere winters from sunny Puerto Rico. The change of weather made it hard to breathe. The workload triggered blinding migraines. They had no money except for the monthly stipend he received from the university. He stood on a bridge for 20 minutes in the snow and rain, unable to move, watching the snow fall beyond the railing into the rift below him and imagining that if he let go, he'd disappear just as peacefully as the snow that went before him. When he finally managed to break his hands away from the rails, he took my mom and ran. He didn't return for 8 months. He told me that story once, and I'll never forget it. I'd see it sometimes in his eyes at times where I'd forget that he'd breaks too. My earliest memory is of an asthma attack. I was 4 years old and my lungs were caving in. I awoke to a tightness in my chest that I didn't understand, and I could hear the scraping wheeze of my own breath, but didn't know the sound was coming from me. I don't remember my mom being there, although I'm sure she was. I only remember him. He took my face in his hands and showed me how to breathe. Slow, steady, 1, 2, 3, 4, in and out, in and out. He carried me to the bathroom and stuck me in the shower with my pajamas on, praying out loud for the steam to fill my lungs and grant me some relief. He was standing in the shower with me, fully clothed, showing me how to breathe again, water dripping down his face, and in his eyes, that expression I wouldn't understand until much later in life. My dad, on a bridge, in the snow and rain, unable to move. When we got home from the hospital, he tucked me back into bed, now with clean sheets still warm from the dryer, sat at the edge of my bed for a moment and looked down at the blood on his shirt, my blood. I heard him breathing as he slowly loosened his tie and reached for the buttons at his collar. Slow, steady, in and out, in and out. I grabbed his hand. Until then, I'd never tried to hold his hand the way he'd done for me. For every time he'd tell me I was strong, I'd never told him that he was too. I'd never tried to carry him when he was broken, to tell him everything would be fine, to lead him away from the rails, to tell him I didn't care about the blood on the back seat, to take his face in my hands and show him how to breathe again. I fell asleep, counting his breaths, as I imagined myself leading him off the bridge. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nina. And I want to ask for one big round of virtual applause for all our readers. Thank you, James, Lizzie, David, Raoul, Bhavika, Hannah, Nina. That was wonderful. So if I could ask everyone to stick around for just a few more seconds for a final word by Literary Festival co-director Catherine Jackson. Thank you.
I'm not able to start my video because the host has stopped it, but I guess you can hear me, so maybe that's just as well. Thank you all so much for those readings, and congratulations on your graduation, and good luck with your work ongoing. The host has asked you to start your video, so now I'm starting my video. All right, we're back on track. We also want to thank John McManus for hosting this event this evening and for everything you've done, John, to help us put together the festival this year. Thank you very much. I also want to thank my co-director, Lyzzie Golliher. Her vision, energy, and enthusiasm are the definition of grit and grace. Louisa, thank you for inviting me to co-direct the festival with you and for everything you've done. Finally, thanks to all of those who have attended this evening's event. We'd like to invite everyone to come back tomorrow for readings at 12:30, 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and 7 o'clock. You can find the festival schedule and access links at odu.edu/litfest, and most events will be live streamed on Facebook at ODU Arts. So that's it for this evening. Thank you so much for being with us. Good night.